The first account was always dismissed as a folktale told by farmhands after long nights of whiskey, yet the details remain too consistent across decades to be forgotten. A family, the Burroughs clan, was said to have vanished from their homestead in 1829, abandoning a thriving farmstead in rural Virginia. When neighbors approached, they found the crops untouched, tools laid out in the barn, and food half prepared on the table. But of the family there was no trace. What made the case disturbing was not the disappearance itself, but the whispered sightings that followed. Accounts of figures pale and hollow-eyed, emerging only when the moon blotted out the sun. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, a physician with a habit of cataloging what others dismissed as superstition, took an interest in the tale years later. In his surviving notes, he wrote with clinical precision, "The Burroughs family did not leave. They adapted. Witness statements indicate subterranean movements, lights beneath the fields, and figures returning during eclipses. Whether by pact or madness, they became creatures of shadow and soil." His colleagues dismissed him as indulging local madness, but Harrow's mind was sharper than most, and he insisted patterns existed where others saw chaos. It began with the livestock. Several neighbors described hearing the animals cry out during nights when the wind was unnaturally still. Hooves scraped against frozen soil as if resisting unseen hands. The farmer Samuel Yates swore he saw a figure rise from the earth itself, dragging a sheep below as though the ground had teeth. It was Yates' testimony that first suggested the impossible, that the Burroughs clan had not fled, but rather chosen a different kind of existence beneath the earth. By mid-century, stories had multiplied. Children whispered of shadows moving inside abandoned wells, of a knock that echoed beneath floorboards, and of footsteps heard during daylight that left no prints in the mud. Harrow collected each fragment, his medical mind struggling to separate fact from hysteria. In his journals, he weighed possibilities: illness that caused hallucinations, mass delusion driven by fear, or perhaps, in the darkest margin, a pact willingly embraced. He noted how the Burroughs had been a family of rigid faith, their patriarch Ezekiel known for sermons more ominous than scripture, warning that the sun itself was corrupt, a false god blinding humanity to deeper truths hidden in darkness. The most troubling detail, repeated across witness accounts, was the timing. The family was never seen except during eclipses. Farmers swore they saw them gather in the fields when the sky darkened, their faces gaunt, their eyes reflecting a strange shimmer as though they had adapted to some other light source below ground. Harrow himself observed one such eclipse in 1847, recording, "The Burroughs Hollow appeared inhabited once more. I saw movement in the windows though the doors were sealed by rot. The silhouette of a woman lingered against the upstairs glass though the house had long been condemned. At totality, the figure retreated, as if the sun's return would annihilate her." These sightings grew harder to dismiss as coincidence. Crops near the Burroughs property withered despite fertile soil, as though something beneath drained life upward. Wells turned bitter, producing water with a metallic taste. The few who dared linger near the homestead at dusk spoke of a low hum, like chanting carried through stone. Harrow grew convinced this was not folklore but evidence of deliberate exile. He theorized the family had enacted a ritual, binding themselves to the shadows below in exchange for some unknown protection or knowledge. If true, it was not a curse laid upon them, but a choice. That possibility unsettled him most of all. The physician's last field note on the matter was brief, but chilling. "I believe they live still. Their pact is intact, and it binds them to return only when the world darkens. If so, the eclipse is not merely celestial, it is an invitation." But what disturbed him beyond reason was the sudden knock he heard beneath his own study floor one silent night, a hollow wrapping in a room where he lived alone. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow wrote of that moment with restraint, but the fear behind his words was evident. He described the sound not as the creak of timber or the scampering of vermin, but as deliberate, 3 precise knocks followed by silence, then 2 more. It carried the cadence of communication. For hours afterward, he sat unmoving at his desk, quill frozen in his hand, waiting for it to repeat. When it finally did, he pressed his palm flat against the wood and swore he felt a vibration rise from the ground beneath him, as though someone far below had struck the earth in answer. Neighbors later recalled that Harrow's demeanor changed after that night. He had always been a man of skeptical inquiry, the kind who dismissed ghost stories with a raised eyebrow. But from then on, he seemed preoccupied with the soil itself. He spent afternoons examining the foundation of his home, tapping stones with a mallet, and sometimes, when he believed himself unobserved, leaning close to the ground as if listening. The second disturbance occurred weeks later during an eclipse that passed partially across Virginia. Harrow, determined to witness it from the Burroughs property, took notes with the precision of a surgeon. He wrote, "At the moment of shadow, I observed figures emerging from the ruined house. Their movements were coordinated as though rehearsed, each carrying a lantern that glowed not with flame, but with a phosphorescent gleam, unnatural to my eyes. They did not acknowledge one another nor me. They walked into the fields and knelt in a circle. The sound of knocking began again, this time rising through the soil in a rhythm echoing their posture. I fear they were not worshiping the eclipse, but answering to something below." The account might have been dismissed as hallucination, yet Harrow included a detail that carried weight. The family was complete. He counted 7 figures corresponding precisely with the last census of the Burroughs household before their disappearance. Not one was missing and none had aged. This revelation unsettled even his most rational colleagues. If Harrow had invented the sighting, why not exaggerate? Why cling to the exact number? Such precision suggested he had seen something, even if it defied explanation. Among the villagers, rumors swirled. Some whispered that the Burroughs had discovered caverns beneath their land and struck a bargain with something that lived in eternal dark. Others claimed Ezekiel Burroughs had led his family into voluntary burial to escape the corruption of daylight, convinced that purity resided only in shadow. Yet there were also those who believed the Burroughs no longer lived as humans at all, that what returned during eclipses were only shells, animated echoes of a pact sealed in secrecy. Harrow wrestled with the question of choice versus compulsion. His notes reveal an obsession with morality. If they are bound by oath, then it is willful. If they are bound by force, then it is enslavement. In both, the result is the same: a family that exists only when darkness reigns. The physician struggled not only with the facts, but with what they implied about humanity's capacity for transformation. Could faith, when twisted to extremity, truly alter the very state of one's being? It was around this time that Harrow confided to a trusted confidant that he had begun hearing the knocks, not only at home, but wherever he traveled. At night, in strangers' parlors, in the echo of church basements, even in the quiet of his own carriage as wheels rattled over cobblestones. Always the same rhythm, always from below. His confidant noted with unease that Harrow seemed to welcome the sound, tilting his head as if listening for instructions. The last entry in this phase of his journal was written in a trembling hand. "I no longer believe I am merely an observer. I fear I am being invited." And 2 nights after writing it, his servants awoke to find his bed empty, his study door ajar, and the faint sound of knocking still echoing from beneath the floorboards. What followed was not silence, but absence, and absence often speaks louder than any sound. The servants searched every corner of the house, their lanterns casting tremulous beams against wallpaper that seemed to shift under the flicker of light. They found no trace of Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, no coat missing, no shoes disturbed, no sign of a hurried departure. His quills lay scattered on the desk, one still dipped in ink as though he had been interrupted mid-thought. But the floor where he had so often pressed his ear bore new marks, faint scratches in a spiral, circling inward to a knot in the timber. It was this detail that most alarmed the sheriff when summoned. He dismissed talk of subterranean knocks but could not explain how a man could vanish from a locked home. The windows were barred, the doors bolted from within. Only the floor with its spiral scoring suggested a route no rational mind wished to acknowledge. Witness accounts emerged quickly. A neighbor swore she saw Harrow crossing the Burrows' property the very night of his disappearance, walking in a stiff, measured stride, neither hurried nor hesitant. His lantern, she said, was unlit, yet he navigated the darkness with uncanny certainty. Another villager claimed to hear voices near the old well, low, chanting murmurs broken by intervals of that same hollow rapping. He thought it was a prayer until he recognized the rhythm as a reply, as though Harrow himself had joined the conversation beneath. What troubled investigators most was the timing. His disappearance coincided precisely with the approach of another eclipse, though this one would only dim the sky partially. Yet villagers whispered that the Burrows family did not require total darkness, only the promise of it, the shadow that foretold greater shadow. In Harrow's journals, discovered later hidden in a locked drawer, his writings had grown erratic. Between clinical notes, he scrawled phrases like, "The soil is not inert, it listens," and elsewhere, "I do not fear the knock, I fear the silence that follows when I fail to answer." Such words no longer read as scientific observation but as confession, a man struggling against a temptation too strange to resist. The case file records that searches were made of the Burrows' hollow ruins. Deputies descended into the cellar, though many refused to linger. They reported an air heavy and damp, with a faint vibration in the walls, as though the earth itself breathed. In one corner lay fragments of candle stubs arranged in a circle, and at the center, a single object, Harrow's pocket watch. Its hands stopped at the precise minute of the eclipse. From then on, the line between superstition and evidence blurred dangerously. Reports of Harrow's figure joining the Burrows clan during eclipses multiplied. Some described seeing him among them, his tall silhouette unmistakable, moving in unison as they knelt in the fields. Others swore they heard his voice among the subterranean chants. It was as though he had not vanished but been absorbed, claimed by the pact he had spent years trying to understand. The physician who once dissected rumor with scalpel-like precision had become part of the very legend he sought to demystify. For the community, this transformed the tale from curiosity to terror. If a man of reason could be drawn into the Hollow Pact, what chance did ordinary folk have of resisting its lure? What haunted the sheriff most was not the disappearance itself, but the night he returned to Harrow's empty study weeks later. Alone, with only the sputter of his lamp for company, he swore he heard it too. 3 knocks, then silence, then 2 more, reverberating beneath the boards where the physician had last stood. And as he fled the house in dread, he caught the faintest impression that the knocks were not asking entry, but offering it. The sheriff never confessed this aloud, not to his deputies nor to the townsfolk who pressed him for answers. He was a man sworn to enforce order, yet what he had heard in Harrow's abandoned study was not something the law could restrain. He told the public only that the physician had vanished, most likely into the wilderness, a man unbalanced by obsession. But in private, he admitted to his own wife that the sound followed him into sleep, manifesting in dreams where his bedposts throbbed like timbers and his pillows seemed to echo with subterranean rhythm. Others began to experience similar disturbances. a merchant who lived 2 streets from Harrow's home, swore he awoke one night to find dust sifting upward from between his floorboards as though the earth below had shifted. A child, playing alone in her parents' parlor, claimed she tapped a wooden toy against the planks and received taps in answer. Her mother laughed until she, too, heard the reply, a series of knocks too steady to be accidental. Patterns emerged. Always the rhythm was the same. 3 knocks, silence, 2 knocks. Harrow had recorded it in his journals, but now it spread among households unconnected to him. The phenomenon appeared contagious, moving from home to home like an unseen fever. For some, it was only sound. For others, it came with visions. A mill worker described waking to find pale figures in his doorway, their eyes reflecting a shimmer as though lit from beneath. They never crossed the threshold, but their presence eroded his sanity until he left town altogether. Dr. Harrow's confidant, who had safeguarded portions of the physician's papers, attempted to analyze these developments with logic. He wrote in a private memorandum, "The knocks appear not as demand but invitation, signaling the possibility of passage. If this is true, then Harrow did not simply vanish. He accepted." The man wrestled with guilt. By entertaining Harrow's delusions in their conversations, had he helped push him toward the abyss? Or was the doctor already lost the moment he heard the first subterranean call? Meanwhile, the Burroughs Hollow homestead began to draw more attention. Trespassers reported strange warmth radiating from its soil, as if a fire smoldered deep underground. Vegetation grew distorted, stalks too tall, roots curling out of the ground like gnarled fingers. Most disturbing were the shapes glimpsed inside the ruined house itself. Windows long thought shattered now glimmered faintly during eclipses, silhouettes moving against the fractured glass. The sheriff, bound by duty, led one final search. He and 2 deputies entered the hollow under moonlight, their nerves frayed by the stillness of the air. They found the house unchanged, collapsed roof, rotted beams, but in the cellar, new carvings scored the stone walls. Spirals again, but more numerous, etched with purpose. At the center lay a fresh circle of candle stubs, melted into the shape of interlocking rings. In the wax was embedded something metallic. It was Harrow's spectacles, bent but intact, lenses reflecting their lantern light like twin eyes staring back. One deputy swore he heard breathing behind the wall. The other claimed to see fingers withdraw into the stone itself. Both refused ever to return. The sheriff recorded the find but omitted the details of the sounds and shadows. His official report reduced the matter to vandalism by vagrants. Yet in his private ledger he wrote a single chilling line. "The knocks are not confined to homes. They travel through the earth itself, a system of communication beneath our feet." What he did not write, though he admitted to himself in silence, was the growing urge he felt each time the knocks came, that they no longer frightened him, but beckoned. And on the night of the next eclipse, when the sky dimmed to a bruised shade of gray, the sheriff was seen walking alone toward Burroughs Hollow, his lantern unlit, his stride measured and certain, as though he already knew the path. That sighting marked the last time Sheriff Elias Moore was seen alive in the town of Ransom Creek. His absence the following morning sent waves of unease through the community, but it was not simply the vanishing of a man of law that unsettled them. It was the realization that he had gone willingly, as though the same irresistible summons that had claimed Dr. Harrow now pulled others into its orbit. Neighbors claimed to see his lanternless figure fade into the mist, swallowed not by distance but by the earth itself. One farmer swore he followed, only to watch in horror as the sheriff reached the threshold of the Burroughs homestead and simply descended, not by stairs, not by any visible entrance, but as if the ground parted to receive him. He ran home muttering that the hollow was no longer a place, but a mouth. What remained of Moore's notes painted a grim picture. Found inside his ledger, tucked between arrest records and unpaid tax accounts, were several pages written in an unsteady hand. In them, he confessed to the mounting temptation. I hear the knocks and I no longer resist. They promise knowledge, not terror. What Harrow saw, I will see. What the Burrows gained, I will inherit. Sunlight blinds, shadow reveals. This notion that darkness could be revelatory rather than concealment disturbed the town's clergy most of all. Reverend Calder preached against it from his pulpit, warning his flock that the pact was not a gift, but a snare. Yet even his sermons trembled with doubt, for whispers spread that he too had heard the knocking beneath the church pews during a prayer meeting. He dismissed it as the shifting of old beams, but those present swore the rhythm was unmistakable. The pattern was becoming undeniable. One by one, those who listened too long, who pressed ear to soil or lingered during eclipses, began to change. They grew restless, sleepless, their eyes rimmed with shadow until at last they vanished altogether. The Burrows family, once dismissed as a vanished curiosity, had become a contagion of belief. Or perhaps something more literal. A new figure emerged during this time. Journalist Clara Hensley, dispatched from Richmond after rumors reached the city. Unlike others, she approached with both skepticism and hunger for truth, recording testimonies meticulously. Her notebooks describe villagers torn between fear and fascination. One woman confessed, "It is not they who return. It is we who are called to join." Clara noted how often the victims described the experience not as abduction but as invitation, echoing Harrow's final words. Her visit to the Hollow was brief but harrowing. She described the land as unnaturally silent, birds refusing to cross the fields, the air heavy with a mineral tang. The ruined house stood as before, but in its windows she saw glimmers, small phosphorescent lights, pulsing in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She fled before sunset, but her journal revealed the unease followed her home. I hear it now, even in Richmond. 3 knocks, silence, 2 knocks. It waits beneath the streets. The pact has no boundaries. The question shifted from whether the Burrows survived to whether their condition could spread, not like disease of the body, but a contagion of the mind or the soul. Harrow, Moore, perhaps even Clara herself. Each had been drawn by the same magnetic cadence, compelled not by force, but by desire. And when the next eclipse arrived, townsfolk reported not 7 figures in the field, but 8, one taller than the rest, a badge glinting faintly on his chest. The sighting spread through Ransom Creek like fire through dry brush. The sheriff had joined them. What had once been folklore was now confirmed by dozens of eyes. A man known to all had crossed the threshold and returned as something else. No one doubted it, for the badge glimmering in the half-light was unmistakable. But what disturbed the witnesses most was not that Moore appeared among the Burrows. It was that he seemed content. His posture was neither forced nor faltering. He stood with quiet conviction, as though he had found the purpose he had been chasing all his life. The figure of Sheriff Moore remained after the eclipse ended. While the others melted back into shadow when the sunlight broke through, he lingered longest, standing upright in the field. Several claimed they saw him glance toward the village, his eyes hollow but alight with that subterranean shimmer. Then, as the sky brightened fully, he sank. Not like a man retreating, but like soil swallowing him whole. Clara Hensley, still investigating, recorded interviews with trembling villagers. One farmer told her he didn't look trapped, he looked chosen. Another muttered that the Burrows were growing in number, not simply returning but recruiting. Clara wrote in her notes, "The pact is no longer a family's curse. It is expanding. Its conditions appear attractive to those disillusioned with the world above." That revelation shifted her inquiry from folklore to contagion of belief. What if the pact functioned less as supernatural binding and more as psychological contagion? She studied Harrow's notes, searching for clues, and found that he had once experimented with false testimonies, telling villagers fabricated details of the burrows, only to discover that weeks later, those very details surfaced in new witness accounts, as if they had always been true. Clara proposed something terrifying, that the pact itself required belief to spread, seeding its rhythms in the mind until the mind opened the body to the hollow earth. The knocks, she suggested, were not simply sounds, but triggers, codes that reshaped perception, aligning listeners with the subterranean covenant. Her hypothesis gained disturbing evidence. A young boy was found in town, tapping on doors with precise rhythm. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. When questioned, he claimed, "They taught me. They say the sun is wrong." His parents swore he had never been near the hollow, yet the rhythm echoed perfectly the sound heard by dozens. This escalation bred panic. Families fled the region, abandoning homes and farms, yet others, more curious or perhaps more desperate, began to linger during eclipses, watching the fields in silence. Some admitted openly that they hoped to be chosen next. To them, the burrows represented not horror but liberation from toil, hunger, and grief. One widower told Clara, "If shadow offers me back what daylight has stolen, why should I resist?" The implications tormented Clara. She began to ask herself in her notes whether she was still documenting or already participating. Her dreams grew restless. She described hearing the knocks in her sleep, sometimes waking to find her own hand drumming against the bed frame in rhythm. She feared she was already compromised. Her last field entry before she left Ransom Creek was brief. "The pact is not a prison. It is a choice repeated until choice no longer feels like choice. Harrow chose. Moore chose. And I fear, even as I write, that I am being prepared to choose as well." That very night, neighbors reported seeing a lantern glimmering at the edge of Burrows Hollow. It moved with the same phosphorescent pulse that marked the family's own lights, weaving through the field until it vanished into the cellar door. Some swore it was Clara herself. By morning, Clara Hensley's lodgings were found abandoned. Her trunk remained packed, her notes scattered across the desk, and her purse untouched. Only her boots were missing, the same pair she had worn during her last interview with the townsfolk. Witnesses insisted they had seen her light, though no one dared follow. The cellar door, once sealed by rot and disuse, now stood slightly ajar, as if the earth itself had shifted to grant entry. What Clara left behind in her notebook was perhaps more chilling than her disappearance. Between careful interviews and documented testimonies, there were diagrams, sketches of spirals carved into stone, circles of candles, and crude maps of underground chambers. One page bore the title, "Subterranean Architecture of the Pact." The drawings suggested not a random scattering of caves, but an organized system, as though someone or something had designed a network of chambers below the burrow's property, complete with ritual centers and marked paths. Her handwriting deteriorated across these final pages. At first neat, it soon slipped into frantic strokes. They are not trapped, they are building. Each eclipse, they expand the network. Each figure seen above means 10 below. The pact is growth. The pact is not survival, it is construction. Those words haunted the few who read them. If true, the Burrows clan was no longer a family story, but an expanding colony. Their subterranean society could already stretch beyond the hollow, unseen beneath farms, roads, and churches. An amateur geologist, summoned by fearful residents, confirmed anomalies beneath the ground. He spoke of vibrations inconsistent with natural formations and of strange hollows that absorbed sound rather than echoing it. "It's as though the earth has been carved into chambers designed to swallow noise," he remarked. His conclusion was grim. Whatever existed below was deliberate, not accidental. The sheriff's successor, a younger man determined to restore order, organized an armed search party. 12 men descended into the borough's cellar, torches in hand. Only half returned. The survivors could scarcely describe what they saw. They spoke of vast chambers illuminated not by flame but by a sickly green glow seeping from the stone itself. They described walls covered in spirals and voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, chanting in perfect rhythm with the knocks that echoed underfoot. Most disturbing was their account of Clara. She stood among the figures, her eyes wide and glassy, lips moving in unison with the chant. She did not appear captive. One deputy swore she smiled faintly, as though greeting them into her new home. When the men tried to approach, the figures dispersed like shadows, melting into the walls themselves. The torches sputtered, the green glow intensified, and panic tore the group apart. Those who escaped insisted they would never return. Their reports were met with disbelief by some, but their terror was genuine. Town records note that within weeks, several of the survivors left Virginia altogether, abandoning land and kin. Clara's fate was sealed in rumor. To some, she was devoured. To others, she had willingly embraced the pact, recording not as a journalist but as a chronicler of her own initiation. Her notebooks ended abruptly, the last line scrawled with unsteady hand. "What is beneath does not remain beneath. It rises through us." And in the following months, more lantern lights were reported at the edge of Burroughs Hollow. Not just one or two, but dozens, pulsing like a constellation inverted, stars shining from beneath the soil instead of the sky. The villagers could no longer convince themselves this was a tale of madness or exaggeration. What had once been whispered in fear became undeniable, visible to anyone with courage or recklessness enough to look. The hollow glowed on certain nights like a vast subterranean city, its lights flickering in patterns no storm lantern could imitate. They pulsed in rhythm like a heartbeat beating below the earth, reminding those who watched that something organized and deliberate lived beneath their feet. Fear drove some to flee, but curiosity rooted others in place. The Richmond Gazette dispatched another investigator, though this time not a journalist but a natural philosopher, Dr. Edwin Marlowe. He arrived with instruments, charts, and an air of condescension, declaring that what the people saw were marshlights, nothing more than gases igniting from decayed vegetation. Yet as days passed, even Marlowe's tone shifted. He measured vibrations in the ground, cataloged changes in water quality, and noted patterns in crop blight that radiated outward from the hollow like ripples. His conclusion, scribbled hastily in his notebook, betrayed his skepticism. These lights obey intelligence. They are no random phenomenon, but a signal system. He stayed longer than was wise. Villagers last saw him walking alone toward the hollow, muttering calculations under his breath, a compass in one hand, a lantern in the other. He did not return. Weeks later, during another eclipse, witnesses swore they saw him among the figures, his scholarly coat hanging loose on a frame that seemed thinner, almost hollowed. The magistrates of the county faced a dilemma. Reports poured in, yet none could be taken as actionable evidence. How could the law pursue lights? How could it prosecute a pact? Officially, they declared the hollow sealed, forbidding entry on penalty of arrest. But everyone knew such proclamations were empty. The pact cared little for fences or decrees. The lights still pulsed, the knocks still traveled through the soil, and one by one, names from the town registry fell silent. The psychological toll deepened. Entire families confessed to hearing the rhythm at night. Some tried to drown it with music or hammering, but the silence between their noise only made the knocks clearer. Others succumbed, repeating the pattern themselves, tapping tables or doors until their neighbors shunned them in fear. One teacher was dismissed after students reported he began class each morning by rapping 3 times, pausing, then 2, smiling faintly as though expecting an answer. Clara Hensley's writings resurfaced during this period, passed from hand to trembling hand. Her theory of contagion gained renewed weight. If the pact was spread by belief and repetition, then the lights themselves might be less important than the minds that recognized them. By witnessing, by recording, by fearing, the villagers might already be participants. In a chilling sermon, Reverend Calder addressed this possibility. He declared the pact a rival faith, one that required no scripture, only attention. To hear is to believe, he warned, and to believe is to be claimed. Yet, even as he thundered from the pulpit, some swore the knocks echoed beneath the church floor, drowning his words with their patient rhythm. By late autumn, Burroughs Hollow was no longer merely a site of dread, but a boundary between 2 ways of being, those who clung to daylight and those who began to long for shadow. When the next eclipse loomed on the calendar, fear became unbearable. Some prepared to bar their homes, while others packed belongings to leave the valley forever. But a small number, restless and pale-eyed, whispered of gathering at the hollow, not to resist, but to join. And on the day of the eclipse, as the shadow of the moon slid across the sun, the villagers saw not dozens, but scores of lights rise from the hollow, spreading outward like roots in every direction, reaching toward the village itself. Panic broke in the streets as the lights crept closer, inching with the steadiness of growth rather than attack. They did not flicker randomly, but in coordinated pulses, as though the underground city itself were breathing, sending out veins of illumination beneath homes, barns, and even the church. Children screamed that the floorboards glowed faintly beneath their feet, and one mother swore she felt warmth radiating from her cellar door, as though fire licked behind it. But there was no fire, only the persistent rhythm of knocks, magnified now until the whole village trembled with it. Crockery rattled on shelves, shutters quivered against their latches, and dogs howled as though warning of a coming storm. To the people of Ransom Creek, it was no longer just Burroughs Hollow that pulsed with forbidden life. It was the very earth under their foundations. Some fled immediately, clutching their children, abandoning everything they could not carry. Others froze, caught between terror and fascination, watching the lights weave beneath their homes like phosphorescent roots. A few, most unsettling of all, opened their doors and stood waiting, as if expecting visitors. It was then that Reverend Calder faced his final test. He had preached resistance, declaring the pact a rival faith. Yet his congregation, huddled in the church as the eclipse deepened, saw his resolve falter. They later recounted that he paused mid-prayer, eyes fixed on the floorboards, as if hearing something no one else could. Slowly, his hand began to tap against the pulpit. 3 knocks, pause, 2. Gasps erupted as parishioners recognized the rhythm. Some begged him to stop, but he continued, a faint smile forming across his lips. The congregation fled in horror, scattering into the eclipsed daylight. Those who looked back swore they saw Calder descend, not through any visible entrance, but straight down, his body folding into the floor as if absorbed. The church bells tolled once and fell silent. By evening, the lights receded from the village, drawing back into the hollow as the eclipse ended, but the damage was done. The pact had reached into the heart of the community, claiming not only their sheriff and their physician, but their spiritual shepherd as well. The people left behind felt hollow themselves, their anchors stripped away. Clara's notebooks resurfacing once more in frightened hands seemed prophetic. The pact does not conquer with violence, but seduces with alignment, she had written. Those most trusted to resist are often the first to yield. Authority itself bends, and once it bends, others follow. What unsettled the few who still resisted was the realization that the lights had not spread at random. They seemed to choose, seeking out the homes of those most burdened with grief, despair, or unspoken longing. Widows, orphans, debtors, the vulnerable were always the first to report knocks beneath their floor, and once they answered, the pattern repeated, expanding outward. The magistrates in Richmond, desperate to quell hysteria, ordered the hollow sealed with stone and timber. Laborers were hired to fill the cellar and collapse the house into rubble. But every man who worked on the project later abandoned his wages and left the county, claiming they felt watched by eyes from beneath the soil. Some whispered that the rubble itself shifted at night, as though the foundation refused to remain buried. When the next eclipse approached, fewer villagers dared watch. Most barred their windows, pretending nothing would happen. But one child, too curious to resist, peeked through a crack in the shutters and later described what she saw. A long line of figures moving from the hollow into the village, each carrying lanterns that pulsed in unison. At their head walked a man in a preacher's robe, face pale, eyes gleaming with subterranean light. The child's description was dismissed at first. Imagination, the product of fear planted by gossip. Yet too many details matched what others had whispered. The phosphorescent lanterns, the solemn procession, and above all, the unmistakable presence of Reverend Calder. If the preacher had once been a man of God, he was now a herald of something that lived below the soil. Those who dared to investigate spoke of chilling signs left behind. Footprints, deep and oddly elongated, marred the earth where the figures had walked. They led not back to the hollow but toward the village square, only to vanish as though the ground itself swallowed them whole. On a well's stone lip, someone or something had carved spirals, fresh and sharp, as if etched with a blade only hours earlier. Dr. Harrow's old notes resurfaced again, passed like contraband among the terrified. His words, once thought the ravings of a man slipping into delusion, now read like prophecy. He had described the pact as a methodical system, each eclipse a stage of expansion. What began as isolation beneath the hollow had become outreach into the community, an infiltration disguised as invitation. He had warned, it will not end with them. Their methods are precise, deliberate, and patient. Each generation is but one brick in a structure not yet complete. The magistrates in Richmond, alarmed by escalating reports, sent officials to investigate. But the men they dispatched were city-born, skeptical of rural superstition. They laughed at the villagers' trembling accounts and mocked the faint knocking that many swore echoed through the courthouse floor. Yet, after only 3 nights, these officials departed suddenly, leaving their inquiries unfinished. No explanation was given. Some suspected they too had heard something in the silence of their rooms that drove them away. By now, it was clear the Pact's influence was not confined to Burroughs Hollow. Its reach spread by sound, by sight, by memory itself. Those who tapped the rhythm, even in jest, often began to dream of voices. Those who stared too long into the lights swore they saw not reflections but signals, messages in patterns they could not decipher. The psychological toll deepened. Families no longer trusted one another, listening for stray knocks in their homes, watching for the faintest signs of hollow eyes. Children were scolded for games of tapping, their laughter cut short by terror-stricken parents. The town fractured into 2 camps, those who insisted the only hope was to burn the hollow to ash, and those who whispered that resistance was futile, that the pact offered inevitability rather than choice. One night, during another partial eclipse, a group of villagers attempted destruction. They carried pitch and fire to the hollow, chanting prayers to drown the knocks. But when they reached the ruins, they found the cellar already alight, not with flame, but with the same phosphorescent glow. Figures stood within, countless and silent, their lanterns forming concentric circles. At the center, Calder raised his hand, and the villagers swore the earth itself moved. The flames sputtered, torches went out, and terror scattered the would-be saboteurs. The following day, strange artifacts appeared in the village square, a collection of objects laid neatly on the cobblestones: Harrow's quill, Moore's badge, Clara's notebook, and Marlowe's compass. Each item bore new spirals carved into its surface. It was not merely a display, it was a message. The Pact wanted them to know their lost had not vanished. They had been repurposed, and as evening fell, the survivors realized with dawning dread that the lights had not retreated to the hollow this time. They pulsed beneath the village itself, spreading in every direction, as though the Pact had already claimed the ground they stood on. For the first time, the villagers understood that Burroughs Hollow was no longer a boundary. The Pact had seeped outward, claiming not just a ruined farmstead, but the very soil beneath their beds, their streets, their sanctuary. The air itself vibrated with the rhythm of the knocks, so constant that silence became the rarest sound of all. Fear became hysteria. Families fled by wagon in the dead of night, abandoning homesteads built by generations. Yet, even as they left, some confessed they could still hear the knocks from beneath the wheels of their carts, as though the rhythm traveled with them. The Pact was not confined by geography. It was portable, insidious, a contagion of perception. Those who remained clung to ritual and denial. They recited prayers until hoarse nailed crosses to doorframes, stuffed rags into cracks between floorboards, but no barrier muffled the vibrations that seeped through earth and timber. Many began to fear not only the Burroughs but themselves. Whose hand might one day start tapping in unison? Which neighbor's eyes might gleam with subterranean light? The case notes of Clara Hensley, preserved in fragments, resurfaced again. Her words now carried the weight of inevitability. The Pact does not conquer swiftly, it cultivates. Those who resist are left untouched. For now, while those most weary are drawn in first. But eventually, resistance erodes. To hear is to believe is to answer, and to answer is to join. The magistrates in Richmond considered drastic action, burning the entire village to cinders, sealing the hollow under stone and salt. But the logistics, and perhaps their own fear, stalled any decisive move. Officials who visited returned shaken, pale, unwilling to speak of what they had seen. One, before resigning his post, admitted only this: "When I closed my eyes, I saw lights beneath the Capitol itself. Do not think it stays in the valley." By this point, the Pact no longer needed secrecy. Figures were seen openly during nights when no eclipse shadowed the sky. They walked the roads in silence, lanterns pulsing, their faces familiar yet altered. Dr. Harrow, Sheriff Moore, Reverend Calder, Clara, all appeared among them, alongside townsfolk who had vanished in recent weeks. Their presence was not fleeting but deliberate, a procession of the claimed. One evening, a deputy left behind in the fractured law office confessed to a colleague that he had begun to dream of the knocks not as menace but as guidance. "It isn't asking," he whispered, "it's teaching." His colleague fled the county the next morning, abandoning his badge. The psychological shift was stark. What had begun as fear was mutating into acceptance, even longing. People who once shuddered at the hollow now gazed toward it with quiet yearning. For those ground down by grief and poverty, the Pact no longer seemed a curse but a promise of escape from daylight's burdens. The most chilling words came from a widowed mother who whispered to her child before vanishing, "We'll never be hungry again." By winter, those who resisted dwindled. A handful of families barricaded themselves, determined to wait for intervention that never came. But even among them, cracks formed. Strange tapping emerged from within their own homes. One by one, the barricades fell from the inside. And when the next eclipse darkened the valley, no one spoke of 7 or 8 figures in the fields. They spoke instead of an entire congregation, dozens upon dozens moving as one, their lanterns pulsing with the rhythm of a heart that belonged to no single body but to the earth itself. The sight silenced even the most skeptical. An entire assembly stood in the fields, row upon row, faces half familiar yet transformed, their features pale and hollow, their eyes catching the subterranean shimmer. This was no scattered haunting. It was an organized body, a church of shadow risen from beneath. The onlookers, few who dared peer through cracks and shutters, swore the figures moved with terrifying precision, each step in unison, each lantern flashing in perfect rhythm with the knocks that now shook the very soil. It was as though the pact had reached its maturity. What began with one family had become a congregation, not of faith but of surrender. Each eclipse had been a rehearsal. Now the performance stood revealed. Among them were not only the Burrows, but Harrow, Moore, Calder, Clara, Marlowe, and countless townsfolk who had vanished. Even those thought long dead appeared, their forms intact, their gazes unbroken. The surviving records describe the effect upon those who witnessed. One man fainted, unable to reconcile the sight of his late wife, standing calmly in the ranks. Another wept openly, torn between terror and longing to join her. The most chilling testimony came from a young girl who whispered, "They looked happy." That word, happy, troubled the few remaining resistors. For what if the pact did not enslave but fulfilled? What if those who vanished had not been lost, but delivered into a state that daylight minds could not comprehend? Harrow had written of liberation, Calder of revelation. Perhaps to them this was not horror but ascension. The county's last attempt at intervention came that night. A handful of men desperate stormed the fields with rifles. They fired into the ranks of figures, bullets cutting through the night. Yet no cry rose, no body fell. The figures absorbed the assault with indifference, their lanterns flickering once, then continuing as before. The men fled in despair, convinced they had shot into shadows that could not be harmed. In the chaos, one villager swore he saw Clara step forward from the congregation. Her face was calm, her eyes luminous, and in her hand she held the very notebook she had once used to record their testimonies. She opened it, though no one could read its contents in the dark, and raised it high as if to declare the record complete. Then she returned to the ranks, her lantern pulsing with the others. After that night, Ransom Creek ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Families fled en masse, leaving houses to collapse, fields to rot. Only the Hollow remained inhabited, though inhabited not in any way daylight minds could recognize. The glow beneath the soil spread outward, subtle but relentless, appearing in distant towns, then in Richmond itself. Reports multiplied, knocks beneath the floorboards of city apartments, lights flickering beneath cobblestone streets. The pact no longer needed the Hollow. It had grown portable, viral, inseparable from the human longing for something beyond the sun. The last written account of that period came from a judge who had once doubted everything. In his journal, discovered years later, he wrote, "They are not gone. They are simply elsewhere. We did not lose them. They chose another way of being. And soon, perhaps, so shall we." And on the final eclipse recorded in the valley, travelers passing by swore they saw no ruined farm, no hollowed church, no village at all. They saw only a vast congregation stretching across the empty fields, lanterns pulsing in rhythm, waiting. The traveler's testimony was ridiculed at first, dismissed as superstition clung to by those who feared unfamiliar lands. Yet the precision of their accounts disturbed scholars who examined them later. Each traveler described the same impossible scene: fields stripped bare of buildings, no evidence of habitation, yet teeming with motionless figures. Lanterns shone with that unearthly phosphorescence, blinking not randomly but in ordered cadence, as though the earth itself communicated in pulses of light. It was then that institutions beyond Virginia began to take notice. Academics in Richmond and even further north attempted to rationalize the phenomenon. Some claimed it was collective delusion, a kind of regional hysteria. Others suggested hidden cults reenacting rituals of secrecy and fear. But those who journeyed to the site seldom returned with their skepticism intact. A medical observer, Dr. Horace Green, ventured into the hollow with instruments to measure air, soil, and water. His notebooks survive, and in them his tone shifts from detached observation to reverent awe. "The congregation does not breathe as we do," he wrote, "yet they endure. The soil hums with resonance, frequencies beneath hearing. I fear the Burroughs Pact was not madness but genius, a reorientation of life toward another source of vitality." Green returned to Richmond briefly, but colleagues noted a profound change. He no longer attended lectures or spoke of his findings except in whispers. Soon after, he vanished, and rumors swirled that his silhouette had been glimpsed among the congregation at the Hollow during the next eclipse, standing as still and hollow-eyed as the rest. This was the pattern now. Those who approached with skepticism returned transformed, or did not return at all. It was as though the Hollow contained not only a secret, but a gravity, a pull on the human mind too strong to resist once witnessed. Psychologists studying the case decades later found the testimonies consistent with what they termed invitational phenomena, events in which the boundary between observer and participant collapses. One scholar noted grimly, "The Burroughs Pact does not spread through force. It spreads by erosion of refusal. The longer one observes, the sooner one belongs." Yet even in the shadow of inevitability, a handful resisted. Survivors who had barricaded themselves away told stories of figures visiting their homes at night, not to break in, but to wait at the threshold. They never forced entry, never spoke. They only stood with lanterns pulsing, patient, as though confident time would erode resistance. Some villagers swore they saw familiar faces among them, siblings, children, parents, all unchanged, all beckoning with silent persistence. It was said that the most dangerous moment came not when the figures appeared, but afterward, in silence. That was when the knocks returned, gentle at first, then growing louder until the listener felt compelled to answer. Once a reply was given, 3 knocks, pause, 2, the house was never safe again. By then, the Pact's influence had spread beyond Virginia. Reports surfaced in Maryland, Pennsylvania, even further afield. Accounts of knocks beneath floorboards, of faint phosphorescent light glowing through cellar cracks, of entire families gone without trace. Yet each report shared one detail: no signs of struggle. Always the departures seemed voluntary, as if the missing had opened a door others could not see. Historians now argue whether Burroughs Hollow ever truly collapsed or whether the village simply transformed, leaving behind only rumor. But the final note in Green's journal, recovered years later from the dust of an abandoned library, spoke of a vision too chilling to dismiss. The congregation does not wait for the eclipse. They prepare for permanence. One day the shadow will not pass. It will remain. And if his words were true, then perhaps the congregation was not waiting in those fields at all. Perhaps they were rehearsing for a world remade in endless twilight, where all of humanity would one day join them in the soil. That possibility turned the tale from a local legend into a chilling prophecy. If the congregation's purpose was not to haunt, but to prepare, then their every appearance was rehearsal for permanence. Each eclipse was less a visitation and more a test, measuring how many would yield, how far the rhythm had spread, how much of the world already pulsed with subterranean light. New reports confirmed the fear. In distant towns, whole households vanished without resistance, leaving meals uneaten and doors unlocked. Witnesses described lanterns glimmering beneath floorboards, strange hums in the earth, and the echo of knocks traveling through stone walls as though the ground itself had become a conduit. Always the rhythm was the same. 3 knocks. Silence. 2. Some argued that resistance only hastened collapse. Villagers who tried to burn their homes, to flee their land, to drown the rhythm in noise. These were the first to vanish. Those who lingered in silence, resigned but fearful, lasted longer, though they too eventually fell. But others, those who yielded early, spoke of the pact not with dread, but with reverence. Survivors of brief encounters described voices beneath the soil, calm and persuasive, promising rest without hunger, communion without grief. For the weary, for the grieving, such promises outweighed terror. The pact did not threaten, it invited. Recovered journals from one of the last resisting households revealed the psychological torment in detail. A father wrote of hearing his lost daughter's voice whisper from beneath the floor, pleading with him to join. His wife began to knock in reply, smiling faintly as though reunited. He barred the cellar, but each night the sound returned, closer, sharper, until at last the family was gone. Only the journal remained, ending with the line, "It is not death that waits below, it is family." The hollow itself once thought the epicenter was no longer needed. The congregation had spread outward, their lights seen in forests, fields, and city streets. Travelers described abandoned churches glowing faintly at night, their windows lit with the same phosphorescent pulse. One letter spoke of a prison where inmates began tapping in unison, their cells echoing with the rhythm until guards abandoned the facility in terror. By now, the pact had infiltrated not only places but institutions. Judges, clergy, and physicians, those entrusted with authority, were among the first claimed. Their influence lent legitimacy, drawing more to follow. The contagion was no longer cultural, it was systemic. Humanity itself seemed to be preparing to kneel. Yet fragments of resistance remained. One group of scholars, examining Clara Hensley's surviving notes, discovered what they believed to be a code within the lantern pulses, patterns repeated across eclipses, sequences too precise to be random. To them, this was not ritual but communication, a message to something beyond human comprehension, perhaps even beyond the earth itself. If true, the Burrows Pact was not merely about survival underground, but alignment with forces greater than the world above. That discovery spread despair more than hope. If the congregation communicated with something deeper, then the story was not one of corruption, but of evolution. Humanity was being rewritten, not erased. And as the next eclipse loomed, reports came from far beyond Virginia. In coastal towns, sailors described lights flickering beneath the waves. In cities, pedestrians heard knocks, echoing through cobblestone streets. The pact was no longer bound to a hollow. It had become a language etched into the foundation of the world itself. When the shadow passed once more across the sun, witnesses swore they saw the congregation not in one place, but in many. Fields, forests, alleys, harbors, standing in ranks, lanterns pulsing, waiting in perfect silence as though rehearsing for the final eclipse, the one that would never end. That image became the closing chapter of Burrows Hollow's story, if story is even the right word. For those who survived to tell it, it was less a tale of superstition and more the slow unveiling of a truth humanity had long refused to see. The pact was not a curse. It was a transition, a reordering of life away from the tyranny of daylight toward a different form of existence. The eclipse was not merely celestial, it was rehearsal for permanence. The records that endure describe the phenomenon not as an outbreak, but as a conversion. Families once fractured by grief were seen reunited in the congregation. The impoverished, the sick, the despairing, all found place in its silent ranks. To those left behind, it was horror, but to those who joined, it appeared as salvation. Clara's words, recovered in the final notebook attributed to her hand, captured the paradox best. It is not that they are gone. It is that they have stepped sideways into a shadow world where hunger ends and grief dissolves. The only price is light. By the mid-century, the Hollow itself no longer existed. The land lay barren, the ruins erased, the village consumed by time. Yet the pact had spread too far to be buried. Reports echoed from distant states, then across oceans. Knocks beneath floorboards in London townhouses, phosphorescent lights in the mines of Germany, silent figures standing at the edge of fields in Japan. Always the rhythm was the same. Always the lanterns pulsed in unison. Psychologists debated whether it was mass hysteria or a cultural myth that crossed borders, but the testimonies grew too consistent. Farmers, sailors, scholars, and children described the same cadence, the same glimmer in the eyes of those who vanished willingly. For those who studied the case, the final realization was the most terrifying. Resistance was not victory, only delay. If Dr. Harrow's first instinct had been correct, that the pact was chosen, not forced, then perhaps humanity itself leaned toward it, inch by inch, eclipse by eclipse. The final eclipse, the one that would never end, was not a prophecy but an inevitability, waiting for enough voices to align, enough knocks to answer. A single question remains in the journals, sermons, and testimonies collected across generations. Was the pact an act of surrender to something alien and parasitic, or was it the next step in human evolution? Were the Burrows a cursed family, or were they pioneers of a future without sunlight? No institution has ever resolved the question. Scholars argue, theologians rage, skeptics scoff, but the knocks continue. In quiet homes across the world, there are still those who wake at night to the sound beneath their floors. Some cover their ears, some pray, and some, trembling, knock back. And for every person who replies, another lantern joins the congregation, pulsing in rhythm, waiting for the shadow that will one day stretch across the sun and never leave. Perhaps the Burrows' Hollow Pact was not about a family, or a village, or even a valley. Perhaps it was about us all. The story remains unfinished, not because it lacks an ending, but because the ending has not yet arrived. So what do you think? Was the Burrows' Hollow Pact a curse, a salvation, or simply a mirror held up to humanity's own longing for release from the weight of light? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories, because often the truths buried in forgotten corners of history are far darker and far closer than we dare believe.